NBC's Tom Brokaw, Reagan biographer Craig Shirley, and Chuck Todd with his Super Tuesday takeaways. You're watching Morning Joe. We will be right back. Joining us now, NBC News special correspondent Tom Brokaw, former senior advisor to Rand Paul's presidential campaign and former speechwriter to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and now an NBC News political contributor, Elise Jordan. In Washington, best-selling author, historian, and prolific Reagan biographer Craig Shirley. And over at the big board, MSNBC's Steve Kornacki.
Still awake.
He's still awake.
He's still awake.
He's the really cool 8th grade teacher you never had.
Tom Brokaw, obviously Donald Trump's victories were the big headlines last night, but you say an equally important storyline was Marco Rubio's failure.
It was, and I don't see where he goes from here. I don't know whether we have the video when he first appeared last night. Right after, it was pretty clear that he had a dismal night. He looked like the guy was running for student council president who just found out he didn't have a date for the prom. I mean, he just, he was frozen in place at that point. Very hard to see how he put something together in which he can stay in place throughout. I think Ted Cruz obviously has a shot at staying in the hunt.
So is it effectively a two-person race, do you think?
I think it's getting to that. We'll see what happens in Florida. Obviously, he'll get a bunch of delegates there if he fulfills his promises. But after that, I don't know where he does. I think people have made a judgment about him in the Republican Party. I mean, there was already discussions last night. Well, he's got a future. He can run for governor of Florida at some point.
Should we move to Craig Shirley on that?
Craig Shirley, you have written about parallels that some have made between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. The only parallels we've made have been the constant underestimation by the political class, by the consulting class, and by the media of both men. Reagan before his sweeping victory in 1980, and Donald Trump up until this moment.
Well, thanks, Joe. I compare dynamics and institutions, but not individuals. You know, you're absolutely right. And I tell people is that before Ronald Reagan was Ronald Reagan wasn't Ronald Reagan. And by that I mean is that, like you said, is that in the 60s and 70s, he was often derided by the Eastern elites, as we used to call it in the old days, by academia. The establishment of the Republican Party. He was considered the George Wallace of the Republican Party, a grade B actor with a premature orange hair. And even as he was in 1980, as he's starting to break loose and head toward the nomination, the party elders, in a panic, ring the fire alarm, break the glass, and go see Gerald Ford. Dick Cheney went to see him. Henry Kissinger went to see him to try to get Ford to get it back into the race, just to stop Ronald Reagan from getting the nomination.
Because there was sheer panic.
I don't know whether that was true or not, or was it that they wanted Ford in the administration? I think by then.
No, that was later. No, Tom, that was later. That was the whole famous Detroit Compact, which you covered, of course, in Detroit in 1980. The famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, the Reagan-Ford co-presidency. But there was a sincere effort, Stu Spencer and others, to try to get Ford back in March of 1980, to try to get Ford to run against Ronald Reagan and stop Reagan from getting the nomination.
You know, Craig, if people want to know how much of a joke Ronald Reagan was seen by just about everybody, one of my favorite lines in All in the Family was when Meathead was mocking Archie Bunker, whose final comeback line that got a roar from the audience is, "That's great, Meathead, but in 1980 you're going to get Reagan." And, the audience exploded because the prospects of a President Reagan were such a joke.
Yeah, absolutely. It was
literally a Norman Lear punchline, and the audience loved it.
In the late 60s, you remember the TV show Laugh-In? Dan Rowan used to do a segment called News from the Future, and he opened up a segment that said, "News from the Future, 1980, President Ronald Reagan," and there he stopped right there because the audience laughed uproariously.
Started laughing. So
I'm not so sure that was true by the time they got to the convention or where they got in the late stages of it. I think that people began to understand that the fact he was a serious contender, and you must remember.
Oh, sure, by 1980, sure, absolutely. Yeah. The world had changed. Carter, of course, helped change that world, and of course the world, with the Soviets on the advance and the bad economy, and Carter obviously, or seemingly in over his head as President of the United States, all helped to create the conditions. But Reagan was smart enough to exploit them and take advantage of the conditions too.
Well, he also had a stunningly brilliant debate against Jimmy Carter.
Yeah,
which said, there you go again. And that changed everything that night. They saw him as a president.
Right. So can the establishment stop Donald Trump at this late stage?
I don't know. I'm actually curious about the 1976 nomination process with Ford and Reagan, because Reagan really didn't win contests. I think he won his first contest in North Carolina, and he really kept this pressure up for so long. And really, it was this example of a long, protracted nominating process. And Ford ended up using the power of the presidency to win over those delegates. But how is that an analogy to what's happening now?
Craig, you're the historian. Is there any possibility that we could see a repeat of 1976?
Yes and no, but the problem is that you had two giants going into Kansas City. Neither, it's the last time Republicans gathered not knowing who the nominee of their party was going to be. When they gathered in Kansas City, they didn't know it was going to be Ronald Reagan or President Gerald Ford. And you're right, is that there was a lot of backroom maneuvering to get Ford over the top to get to 1,130 delegates by the time of the voting on Wednesday of that night. But right now you just have Trump. You don't have an anti-Trump. You have a series of little anti-Trumps, whereas you had Reagan and anti-Reagan. But so you don't have countervailing forces against each other.
You also don't have the power. You don't have the power of the president.
You don't have a better option.
Right.
All right. Yes. Tom Brokaw, Elise Jordan, Craig Shirley. So much.
Thank you.